The blazing sky over Arizona cast a deep orange light across the highway as Emma drove in silence, relishing the rare peace of her late-night journey home. The road stretching ahead was nearly empty, broken only by the occasional sway of desert, brush and the distant glimmer of a gas station sign. Emma took comfort in these drives. She had traveled these stretches so many times that every crack in the pavement and faded mile marker felt familiar, like pieces of a puzzle she knew by heart. The whine of sirens shattered the calm. At first, Emma registered the sound with only mild annoyance, figuring it was another rush to a car crash or some petty dispute in the next town over. But when the flashing blue and red lights cut across her rearview mirror, painting quick, erratic shadows inside her car, she knew this wasn't just a passing emergency. Years of practice and discipline kicked in. She slowed down, checked the shoulder, and guided her old Toyota over to the side with a steady hand, keeping her breathing slow and easy. This wasn't Emma's first encounter with the police on these isolated Arizona highways, but something felt off. With the engine idling softly, she kept her hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, as she had learned to do early in her career. Discipline in moments like this was everything. It was the difference between a simple ticket and misunderstanding that could spiral. Her heart thudded once, hard, but she refused to let the nerves take over. Through the side mirror, she saw a patrol car door swing open, and a tall, squared-shouldered officer stepped out with a rigid posture. The man's approach was measured and deliberate, his boots crunching on the gritty shoulder as he made his way to her window. Even before he reached her door, Emma could sense the tension. Something here was different. The officer's hard, icy stare did not match the routine traffic stops she had endured before. As cold desert wind slipped through the half-open glass, Emma felt a sudden heaviness settle in the air. She locked eyes with the officer, John, whose expression carried a suggestion of hostility rather than routine. In that moment, Emma realized she was stepping into a dangerous game, one where every word and gesture could alter what happened next. The stop itself felt jarring from the start. Officer John didn't bother with any kind of greeting or explanation. Instead, his first words came out clipped and cold. "License, registration," he demanded, not even a hint of the usual "good evening" or "how are you tonight?" Emma tried to keep her tone steady and neutral, but every answer she gave seemed to fuel his suspicion. His questions came rapid fire. "Where are you coming from this late? Why are you taking this route? Anyone else in the car?" He barely let Emma finish before moving on, as if he was searching for the answer he wanted, not the one she could actually give. From the driver's seat, Emma could tell John had already decided she was hiding something. No matter how carefully she chose her words, he watched her face with a look that crossed intimidation and impatience. It was clear he wasn't just following orders. The way he leaned into the window, his voice low but sharp, made it seem like he was trying to rattle her. Emma kept her hands where he could see them and forced herself to stare straight ahead, counting her breaths, not daring to show how much this bothered her. Before she could even guess what might happen next, another set of headlights pulled up behind John's cruiser. A second officer, a woman named Maria, got out and strode over, making her presence immediately felt. Maria didn't say much. She didn't need to. Standing just behind John, she watched Emma with the same skeptical glare, her arms folded tight across her chest. The two officers worked in silent tandem, shooting glances at each other that seemed to speak volumes. With only a few grunted words between them, they motioned for Emma to open her trunk, their movements brisk and rehearsed. As Emma stepped out and popped open the trunk, she could feel how the night had taken an awkward turn. The officers rifled through her bags with practiced hands, checking under jackets and around spare tires, eyes scanning for who knew what. They moved in sync, never relaxing for a second, their accusatory looks looping back and forth. Emma realized this wasn't at all like a normal traffic stop. The pressure in their voices, the way they moved together, it felt like she was caught in the middle of something much bigger, something that went way beyond any regular night on an Arizona highway. The words hit Emma like a slap. Maria, without so much as looking up, announced in a flat voice, "Cocaine." The word hung in the air, sharp and final. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Emma's mind buzzed with disbelief. She stared as Maria held up a small plastic bag as if she expected everyone present to know exactly what it was supposed to mean. The world around Emma seemed to quiet, every noise fading except the pounding in her chest. She knew for a fact that bag hadn't been in her trunk, not in her luggage, not hidden in any of the side compartments, nowhere. Still, Maria's declaration was delivered with the kind of certainty that suggested the matter was already settled. Emma's shock was plain, but she clamped down on her first urge to protest, resisting the rising wave of panic. Deep down, she almost expected something like this. The whole stop had felt orchestrated from the second John walked up to her window. Refusing to play along with their act, she fixed her eyes on Maria and John, her face set and her posture firm. Growing up, Emma had learned early that showing fear only gave people more ground to push. Now that training kicked in. She forced her voice to stay even as she replied, "That's not mine. I have no idea where it came from." Neither officer even blinked. John began radio chatter, speaking in hushed but urgent tones, while Maria seemed to catalogue each of Emma's reactions, as if rehearsing a story for a report she'd already planned to file. It was now painfully clear that this was no simple mistake. Emma felt the injustice pressing in on her chest, but did everything she could to stay calm. She had spent years in jobs that required her to adopt new names and histories, always hiding in the background. Those experiences gave her nerves of steel when it counted most. She wouldn't let herself break down, not now. Every time she looked back at the officers, Emma refused to let her gaze flicker. She would never give them the satisfaction of seeing her fall apart. Even as they spoke to each other in clipped, low voices, as if confirming details in advance, Emma knew this setup was deliberate. She understood now she wouldn't be able to trust anyone in uniform tonight, and that for the moment her only option was to carefully watch and remember everything. The next moments unfolded in a blur that felt both unreal and painfully sharp. One of John's hands guided Emma out of the vehicle, while Maria snapped cold metal cuffs around her wrists. The desert night pressed in, colder now, as Emma took in her surroundings for what felt like the 100th time. There was no comfort left in her old Toyota or the familiar shadows of the highway. She tried to keep her head up as they walked her to the back of the cruiser, but the humiliation stung. The officers didn't speak, except for clipped instructions. Inside the car, Emma braced herself for what would come next. When they reached the county holding facility in Tucson, everything became even more impersonal. Harsh fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered overhead as Emma was led through long, echoing corridors. The air was thick with tired resignation from other officers and the low hum of distant voices. Nobody called her by name. They just read her file number, repeating it again and again. A guard with a flat expression took her fingerprints. Another checked her clothing and belongings, every step a reminder that she had been reduced to just another case in the system. The concrete walls of her cell felt unnecessarily close, a kind of tightness that made it hard to take a full breath. The bunk was nothing more than a slab with a thin blanket, and a single bolted-down toilet completed the scene. Emma sat quietly, forced to listen to the footsteps of guards out in the hall, the buzz of the intercom, and the clatter of handcuffs. From somewhere nearby, the The routines of the place, meals slammed through a small slot, lights flashing on and off, guards scanning with practiced disinterest, could easily eat away at someone unprepared for them. But Emma was no stranger to these kinds of systems. She'd spent years on the margins, learning how bureaucracy could wound in ways that weren't always visible. Emma made a point of watching everything. She took mental notes of every guard's badge, every offhand comment, and every coded look between staff. When guards whispered, she learned to pick out names and remember details. She realized quickly that survival wasn't just about getting through the day, but about remembering everything, even the smallest gesture or word. Each little defeat, every insult or indignity, she chose to store away, not as trauma, but as another way to fight back. No matter how grim things looked, Emma quietly promised herself that she would not let this place beat her. Every day was a new chance to resist. The shared cell offered little privacy or comfort. Emma found herself surrounded by 5 other women, some sitting silently on their bunks, others whispering in low voices. The weak overhead lights flickered on and off, making it impossible to know if it was day or night. Sometimes hours seemed to crawl by, each minute stretched by constant interruptions, yelling from another cell, the slam of a gate or a guard barking at someone down the hall. Time lost its meaning in that cramped space. The noise blended into a steady background hum, as if the jail itself was determined to keep the women tense and off balance. Emma kept her eyes open, quietly studying the women around her. They all carried invisible burdens, a mother separated from her kids, a teenager with a long-heeled black eye, an older woman who stared at the floor and never joined the conversations. Each set of eyes told a different story. Sometimes, Emma caught snatches of conversation about crooked court deals or arrests that never made sense. She realized most women here were victims of a system that rarely cared what the truth actually was. Even while trying not to draw attention, Emma's mind worked non-stop. She began to put together mental blueprints of the entire block. She tracked when the guards came by on their rounds, which corners the cameras couldn't quite reach, and where the older pipes groaned the loudest, under the floor. Every day she filed away new observations. How one guard paused for cigarettes at the far window, how another always fumbled with the keypad on the side door, and which inmates knew how to get extra food without being caught. Despite feeling isolated and degraded, Emma refused to let the situation crush her spirit. Any time humiliation came, whether it was a snide remark from a guard or a pat-down in front of the others, she swallowed her anger and forced herself to stay focused. She knew survival here required more than strength. It was about adaptability, resourcefulness, and keeping a cool head. She listened more than she spoke, searching for possible friends or safe contacts, never forgetting that winning trust in here could be a life raft. Emma never allowed herself to lose hope. Her purpose pushed her forward. Escaping wasn't just about freedom. It was about proving the truth and righting the wrong that put her there in the first place. Emma's biggest headache wasn't just the cell or the guards. It was the silence coming from her contact, Michael. He was her closest link to the network that shielded people like her across Arizona, always on call to step in if things went sideways. But Michael had gone dark. She knew from past instructions that radio silence was part of protocol, especially over weekends. Still, the knowledge that she wouldn't be able to reach him until Monday gnawed at her nerves. Her usual backup plans, so carefully built and guarded, now felt like distant memories. The layers meant to keep her safe had become walls cutting her off from the help she needed the most. With each passing hour, Emma's sense of isolation grew stronger. She played over the last 24 hours in her mind, dissecting each decision. She regretted not texting Michael about her planned route that afternoon. It had felt like such a short, boring drive that she barely thought twice. Failing to check in before heading out to meet her informant suddenly seemed reckless. Emma reminded herself she couldn't have known how quickly trouble would close in, but the what-ifs still kept her awake at night, tracing circles in her mind. She reconsidered her last conversation with her informant, trying to remember if there'd been any red flags or warnings she'd missed. Had she gotten overconfident? Sometimes, when work meant going from one safe house to another, it was easy to forget just how fast things could shift. She knew it was her responsibility to keep the network operating smoothly, so being stranded, unable to warn anyone, was more than just inconvenient. It left her vulnerable in ways she didn't want to admit. During the rare moments when the cell was quiet and the others dozed or stared out the tiny window, fear started to creep in. It wasn't the panic of someone new to this world, but a bone-deep dread of what could happen if she stayed invisible for too long. She wondered if anyone would realize she had disappeared. Would Michael piece things together if she didn't? And check in? Would the organization send someone to look for her, or would her absence just get lost in the shuffle of bigger emergencies? Determined not to give in, Emma steadied herself. Instinct would have to carry her through this mess, at least until contact opened up again. She forced herself to stay sharp, searching for any sliver of opportunity. Emma knew that even in this hole, she couldn't let her guard down, not for a second. Early Monday morning, not long after the first round of roll calls echoed down the hall, a guard called Emma's name. She was taken through a maze of sterile hallways into a cramped, windowless interview room. Sitting across from her was Adam, the public defender appointed to her case. Adam looked tired, his tie was crooked, and he had coffee stains on his shirt sleeve. He barely met her eyes as he scanned the stack of papers in front of him. His first words made it clear he didn't have high hopes. "So, Emma, you've been charged with intent to distribute. Standard procedure here. Plea deals come up fast." His voice didn't waver, but there was no warmth or encouragement either. Emma tried to explain how she'd been set up, but Adam kept interrupting, reading off her charges without really listening to her side. He asked the bare minimum, how she'd ended up on that stretch of highway, if she'd ever used drugs, if she wanted to take a deal. Each question felt routine, like something from a checklist, and Emma got the impression he wasn't hearing a word she said. When she began to mention details that could have pointed to her innocence, like how the officer's behavior had been off from the start, Adam just nodded absently. He didn't ask follow-up questions or dig deeper. Instead, he moved on each, time as if trying to finish a task rather than help her. It became painfully obvious that Adam was overworked or just defeated, maybe both. She saw the resigned slump in his shoulders, the tired look that suggested she was only one more file in an endless line of lost causes. In that moment, Emma stopped trying to convince him or hope that he might suddenly become invested in her case. This was not someone who would fight for the truth or question the so-called evidence that had been planted to frame her. Coming back to her cell afterward, Emma's mind shifted gears. The lack of real support or genuine advocacy wasn't a shock. It was just another sign that the system wasn't built for people in her position to get justice. Relying on outside help would only get her so far. If she was going to make it out, Emma realized, it would be on her own terms. She would need to put all her focus into carefully planning her next steps, not waiting for miracles or rescue. Her fight had to come from inside. When the next morning rolled around, Emma barely had time to take a few sips of the awful coffee that passed as breakfast before another guard appeared at her cell. Without a word, he motioned for her to get up. No public defender met her in the hallway. She was marched alone through a set of heavy grey doors into an interview room that felt even colder than before. Inside, Officer John and Officer Maria were waiting for her. The looks on their faces were smug, as if they genuinely believed they finally had everything they needed to break her down. On the steel table between them sat two pieces of so-called evidence, her encrypted phone and the same little plastic bag of white powder that had started this whole mess. Maria started the conversation, showing Emma her own phone, which made her stomach twist. She had worked hard to keep that piece of technology clean of anything that could tie her to the network. Maria laid out their story, saying they had uncovered proof of criminal intent. John chimed in with more accusations, sliding copies of text messages across the table, messages that Emma knew could only appear suspicious, taken out of context. Emma refused to let them shake her. She stayed calm, letting them talk, and then did something unexpected. She pushed back. Instead of denying everything outright, she started asking her own questions. "So, when exactly did you find that bag, officer?" she said, meeting John's eyes. "Mind telling me why only one officer handled my car when you both were supposed to be present?" Her tone was steady and polite, but there was a bite beneath the words. She kept going, poking gentle holes in their story with questions that seemed innocent but had a point. "Is it standard here to search a vehicle after the driver has already been searched? And do you always record searches? Because if you have that footage, I'd like my lawyer to see it." Emma noticed a flicker in Maria's expression, just a tiny twitch that said maybe she was not as sure as she pretended. Every time Emma made them answer for themselves, their confidence chipped away. Maria and John started glancing at each other, instead of only at her. Emma kept her focus. She was not the villain in their story, and she was determined to use her wits to keep taking the ground back, minute by minute, with every careful question. On her way back to the holding area, Emma noticed something that didn't fit with the steady routine she had come to expect. At the far end of the hallway, near the exit to her cell block, Officer Kevin lingered. By a bulletin board, shuffling papers with nervous fingers, he was younger than the others, maybe in his late 20s, and stood out as someone who hadn't yet learned that stiff, unfeeling look many of the senior officers wore. Kevin glanced up as Emma passed, just briefly, but their eyes met, and in that split second she caught a flicker. He looked away fast, as if worried someone else might notice, but curiosity and maybe even worry showed on his face. He kept his mouth shut, yet something about the whole encounter hinted that everything was not as solid inside the ranks as the officers wanted outsiders to believe. That look stuck with Emma as she was escorted the rest of the way to her shared cell. While the guard on duty barked for her to hurry up, her mind was already racing through the possibilities. She reviewed the short history she'd been piecing together over the days spent in holding, whispers among officers, the quiet clicks of radios being switched off when she was nearby, the odd way John and Maria had started to act just slightly on edge, when their stories didn't quite line up. Now, this young officer's nervous hesitation was one more loose thread. By the time the cell door clanged shut behind her, Emma was reworking her mental files. Kevin's subtle reaction stood out in a sea of robotic behavior. If he was having doubts, or if he was even just uncomfortable with the way things were being handled, that could make him a valuable wedge. Knowing how to read people was a skill Emma had relied on time and again, and this was a signal she couldn't ignore. Tiny moments were often what kept her one step ahead. She noted every detail, how Kevin's hand trembled slightly as he straightened, the posted roster, his tendency to linger instead of rushing on with the rest, and the way he avoided eye contact with the older officers. In this place, survival depended on catching the smallest changes around her. Emma quietly started to reshape her approach, thinking through every exchange, replaying words and body language, hunting for her opening, not just to save herself, but maybe to break the silence that protected everything wrong in this place. Back in her cell, surrounded by the sounds of restless breathing and quiet mutters, Emma leaned against the wall and let her thoughts drift to the past. Night had settled over the Phoenix Detention Center, and the fluorescent lights, temporarily dimmed for what passed as sleeping hours, cast a dull glow that felt more unsettling than comforting. It was in moments like these, when she could hear only the hum of air vents and the occasional clang from down the hall, that her focus sharpened the most. Emma remembered the early days with the network, before things had gotten so complicated. She thought about long nights in cool desert safe houses, changing clothes and hair, swapping license plates on borrowed cars, slipping in and out of neighborhoods where nobody knew her name. There was nothing glamorous about the work. It was about keeping your head down, blending in, waiting for the right moment and continuing on no matter how heavy things felt. Most of the missions weren't about dramatic escapes or outsmarting bad guys in loud, showy ways. It was about outlasting the pressure and knowing when to vanish into the background. There had been a time years ago when Emma had lived for adrenaline, wanting every operation to feel like a storybook fight for justice. Now she understood something deeper. Real infiltration was about patience, about being as ordinary and forgettable as possible. Nobody noticed you if you smiled. At the gas station, Clark walked with purpose, but never in a rush, and knew how to ask for directions in all the right local ways. Emma had spent months living as different women, collecting bits of each new city she passed through. Favorite breakfast joints, shortcuts behind grocery stores, coffee orders that marked you as a regular. Memory after memory came back, and it was all connected to her situation now. She realized her survival, right there in that cell, depended on the same things: being invisible when it mattered, knowing when to speak up, and when to let suspicion fade away. What seemed like weakness, quietness, waiting, letting others think you were defeated, was often the only way through. Every operation that had gone well in the past had required her to trust her timing, hold on to what she knew, and resist the urge to act before she saw a real opening. Emma breathed in slowly, feeling her nerves start to settle again, holding on to the skills that had always seen her through danger before. It was strange how, once Emma started putting the scattered pieces together, she could see the larger pattern hanging over Phoenix, like smog. Sitting wakeful in her bunk, she filled in blanks using information she'd memorized from past assignments and whispered reports. It wasn't just her case. It was the city itself, a place where the system was so tangled up in questionable arrests and lost evidence that you could almost hear stories of it leaking from the walls. She remembered hearing conversations that had nothing to do with her but always seemed to end with, "Well, do not fight it. That is just how Phoenix works now." Emma's thoughts turned to Officer John, whose name she had seen before, years back, tucked in those confidential network updates. His methods had always drawn a red flag: sudden busts that fell apart when taken to court, suspects who vanished from records, files sealed with barely a signature. Emma realized now that her routine traffic stop had never been random. John's approach, the way he applied pressure, and the confidence he'd shown with Maria in that interrogation room she'd seen. That dance described before, always in the grey areas where the truth went to disappear. It was different now, though. She'd gone into the work thinking she could keep it professional, stay detached, but the small injustices had piled up. When she'd exchanged that glance with Kevin or heard the fatigue in her public defender's voice, something shifted. It was more than just another mission. It was personal. It felt like a fight, not just for herself, but also for every person who had vanished into the cracks of the local justice system. Every rumor she had ever heard, every hush-hush transfer between counties, now it all fit together. She recalculated her plans while thinking about what she had learned from the network about different counties in Arizona, how Phoenix's problems always seemed to slip quietly into the next jurisdiction. There were patterns in the ways officers talked to one another, in how reports disappeared, and in who got marked as trouble and swept away. Behind every cold stare or lost file, she could sense a larger web, one she would have to unravel if She wanted any chance at real freedom. Emma was not just fighting for survival now. She was ready to pull at the threads that held this whole mess in place. The day finally came for Emma's first court appearance, but it felt less like a chance at justice and more like just another step in a process that was already decided. Judge Miller sat high above everyone else, slumped in his chair as if he had seen hundreds of these hearings and cared little for any of them. The judge seemed to be thinking about when the day might end or whether his coffee would still be warm, instead of actually paying attention to what went on in the room. There was nothing inspiring or reassuring about the way he looked at anyone. His gaze was tired, drifting over the people in front of him like he was barely still awake. Emma stood in the middle of the courtroom. Her wrists were cuffed. A guard stood just behind her, and she felt the heavy stares of Officer John and Officer Maria from the prosecution's table. The two of them almost looked proud of themselves, as if they had achieved something remarkable by getting her up there. Their files were stacked high, and they nodded along whenever the prosecutor spoke, sure of the story they had built together. Emma's public defender, Adam, leaned back in his seat like he already knew there was nothing he could do. When the time came to read the charges, the clerk's voice didn't waver. Each accusation was spoken as if it were fact, weaving together small bits of truth and a lot of things that Emma knew were flat-out false. She listened as they bent details just enough, pulling from actual evidence but arranging it all so that the worst picture of her emerged. The prosecutor calmly laid out the timeline, showing the encrypted phone, mentioning the so-called drugs, and never once questioning where any of it actually came from or who might have put it there. If someone had walked in off the street and listened for just 5 minutes, they probably would have thought the whole thing sounded completely legitimate. There she was, in cuffs, with a bored judge, 2 confident cops, and a defense attorney who did not even try to object. Emma felt exposed, but she noticed how the courtroom buzzed more with impatience than tension. It was clear no one was really expecting answers. Everyone seemed to believe she was already guilty before she even opened her mouth. That, she realized, was how the city kept everything running so smoothly. No one took a second look at cases like hers. As Officer John took the stand, his voice rose just enough to sound official, but Emma could hear the cracks running through his story. He talked about the stop in careful detail, claiming it was just a routine check at a busy Phoenix intersection, that everything was handled by the book. But she caught the moments where he stumbled, his timeline shifted slightly, or he dodged around specifics she knew would not make sense if anyone bothered to push back. No one in the courtroom seemed bothered by the gaps, but Emma locked onto each one, storing them away, bit by bit. Next up was Officer Maria, and her nerves were harder to hide. Maria kept her eyes locked on a spot just above the judge's head, refusing to meet Emma's gaze. Emma almost felt sorry for her, knowing the pressure Maria must have been feeling up there with everyone watching. Maria stuck closely to her partner's account, but the way she phrased things was cautious. Occasionally, she corrected small parts of John's story or dodged a detail by saying she could not recall exact moments. It was subtle, but if you listened for it, Maria's fear and guilt worked their way through her testimony. She talked about evidence found, about procedures followed, but all in a way that felt more rehearsed than real. Emma realized just how much the whole thing was like a high school play. Officers, John and Maria, played the heroes, doing what they could to keep the city safe, at least in the eyes of the court. Judge Miller settled into the role of the all-knowing authority, letting the routine carry on with only the lightest touch. Even her own lawyer read his lines, mumbling out objections that were half-hearted and quickly dismissed. But Emma would not just play her part. With every contradiction in their stories, every sideways glance or nervous twitch, she gathered her strength. The truth ran underneath everything they said, and it was only a matter of time before it broke the surface. Her calm, steady presence was starting to get noticed. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances, shifting in their seats as if they too sensed something was off. While they all followed their scripts, Emma was planning her own way forward, ready to flip the story the minute she saw a crack in the performance. Just when it seemed like the outcome was set and everyone's role had been locked in, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. All heads turned as Special Agent Rachel stepped in, carrying a folder thick with what looked like official seals and signatures. Her walk was brisk and certain, and the moment she called out for attention, the bored routine buzz in the room died off instantly. Even Judge Miller straightened up, caught off guard by the confidence in Rachel's voice. Rachel did not waste time or words. She moved right to the front of the courtroom, handed sealed documents directly to the judge, and announced, "These records are the result of a long-running investigation by federal authorities." The courtroom held its breath as the judge, suddenly alert, scanned the top pages. Off to the side, Officer John's jaw clenched, and Maria shrank back with wide eyes. They looked as if the ground was starting to slip beneath them. What Rachel had brought forward wasn't just some bureaucratic paperwork. It was months' worth of surveillance records, transcripts of phone calls, and copies of files that had supposedly gone missing from the precinct. Every bit of evidence pointed to patterns of misconduct, irregular bookings, altered logs, and evidence checked out under fake signatures, things that matched up perfectly with the shady stops and neat lies tied to Emma's case. Rachel read from the documents with calm authority, her tone making it clear she was not looking for debate or spin. The mood in the courtroom changed fast. People who had seemed impatient before were now wide-eyed, whispering quietly, trying to figure out what this meant. Emma watched as the officers and even Judge Miller realized the usual story would not protect them today. The certainty was gone from John and Maria. They shifted in their seats and avoided eye contact, a world away from the cool confidence they had shown just an hour earlier. For Emma, it all came together. She saw power flip sides in real time. The same people who had run the show minutes ago now looked lost. The system, so sure of itself, was shaking for the first time. The audience, jury members, gallery watchers, and even the clerk leaned in, aware that something real was finally breaking through the layers of practice and routine. The play was over, and a different story was finally about to begin. Behind the scenes, as the courtroom buzzed after Rachel's dramatic entrance, the true mountain of evidence began to surface. In a small conference room off the main hall, federal agents unpacked boxes and cases, laying out pages of documents, hard drives packed with audio, and stacks of signed statements. Every piece had been gathered quietly over the past several months by Rachel and her team at the Bureau. They had gone through text messages, hours of police radio chatter, and even sworn affidavits from people too scared to speak up until now. The chain of misconduct, manipulation, and straight-up criminal activity stretched far beyond Emma's case alone. Bit by bit, the shape of the trap became clear. Things Emma had sensed but never been able to prove, like sudden changes in booking. Logs or unexplained evidence handling errors were now spelled out in black and white. Rachel and her agents handed copies of critical transcripts to both the judge and the city's lead prosecutor. Even the officers who had backed John and Maria realized that the game was up. They looked at the spread of evidence and fell silent, unable to argue or explain what was in front of them. When the court reconvened, Emma, for the first time, was allowed to speak as more than a defendant. Her hands were uncuffed, and she was asked to stand before the judge, this time as someone whose testimony actually mattered. Speaking with the calm of a person who had survived far worse, she laid out the pattern of abuse directed at women travelers over the last few years. She recounted how she'd seen officers target certain women, especially those who looked like outsiders or those traveling for work, and how files connected to investigations would quietly disappear as soon as questions were raised. Emma described moments where she had watched evidence go missing or seen witnesses silenced by paperwork delays. Suddenly, the old narrative of just doing our job felt empty. The judge listened without interrupting, attention fixed. Those who had always trusted the police to get it right heard the uncomfortable truth. Corruption was not some rare mistake, but a system propped up by silence and routine lies. All at once, people who thought uniforms automatically meant honesty saw just how fragile those assumptions really were. For the first time, Emma's story broke through, leaving the courtroom with more questions than easy answers and giving hope that maybe this time things could change. The decision came down with a thud, clear and direct, leaving no space for resistance. Judge Miller, no longer slumped in his chair, spoke with a new confidence as he ordered Emma's immediate release. The paperwork for her freedom was rushed through faster than anyone in the courtroom could remember. At the same time, federal agents quietly moved to the prosecution table, asking officers John and Maria to surrender their badges and weapons. Shock rippled across the room as they were led away, no longer the confident figures from earlier, but now stumbling, eyes wide with disbelief. Emma, standing by her lawyer, watched the entire shift with a strange sense of relief and exhaustion. She rubbed her wrists, feeling the air on her skin after so much time in cuffs. She could not stop thinking about how, only a few hours earlier, everyone had treated her like a lost cause, someone whose outcome was already sealed. And now, because someone had finally listened and cared enough to dig deeper, her story was being taken seriously. She was not just a case file or a problem to be processed. Her words and experiences mattered. While the chaos unfolded, the rest of the courtroom sat frozen, caught between surprise and silent shame. Jurors and spectators alike were left stunned at how easily things had flipped. No one spoke. Some looked away in discomfort, others stared at their shoes, struggling with the fact that they had nearly let an innocent woman's life be destroyed without question. The atmosphere around John and Maria changed completely. The false pride they had walked in with had vanished, replaced with a mix of confusion and panic. They huddled together in tight whispers as agents guided them away, the reality settling that their positions did not make them invincible. For the first time, they felt what it was like to be powerless, to be seen as a problem rather than a hero. The trial they thought they controlled had turned on them, and there was no script they could follow now. Federal authorities from the Bureau took the case into their hands, making it clear that any further investigations would be handled far from Phoenix's old routines. Emma knew her battle was not over, but at least the ground was no longer shifting beneath her feet. The courtroom began to empty, the sounds of footsteps echoing as everyone came to terms with the fact that nothing would ever be quite the same. Outside the courthouse, life went on across Phoenix, but inside the federal investigation headquarters, things were just heating up. Emma now found herself working closely with Rachel and her team, not as a target, but as someone whose insights were essential. With the case files sprawled across tables and whiteboards filled with scribbled lines and timelines, the investigators dug into what had really been going on all those years. Every day, new pieces of the puzzle dropped into place. Agents traced unauthorized entries into police evidence rooms, discovered security camera footage with gaps suspiciously lining up with missing files, and uncovered call logs between officers and known suspects, some of whom were being watched on the other side of the state. The evidence grew quickly, forming connections no one had bothered to look for before. Emma and Rachel pored through tall stacks of reports, looking for dates that did not match or items checked in that vanished by the next shift. They compared the names of officers on duty with the timing of break-ins to the secure rooms where drug evidence was held. One pattern became clear. The same people kept popping up, whether it was logs tampered with or calls made on nights when seized evidence disappeared. What looked like sloppy mistakes at first were actually deliberate choices made to cover up something much bigger. Emma's experience as both a traveler and a victim gave Rachel's team the edge they needed. She remembered faces, odd conversations, and small details about how paperwork was handled. She and Rachel questioned why certain reports had entire paragraphs blacked out, or why original audio was replaced by transcriptions that left out key phrases. The two sat together late into the night, eating cold takeout and working by the glow of desk lamps. Emma saw just how deep the rot went. It was no longer about a single wrongful arrest or one or two bad cops. It was about a whole culture of quiet deals and cut corners, propped up by people who figured no one would bother to look too closely. By then, Emma understood that her nightmare was only the tip of something huge. The crimes at play weren't limited to what had happened on her worst night. The more they dug, the clearer it became. This was a web wrapped tight around every part of the system, and pulling at one piece meant unraveling years of hidden wrongdoing. As the investigation picked up, all kinds of digital clues and stacks of old paperwork told the same disturbing story. The more Emma and Rachel dug, the more they realized this was no accident or series of slip-ups. There were fingerprints, sometimes literal, sometimes electronic, showing how evidence was swapped in and out of boxes, all to fit whatever story the officers needed to tell. Emails showed quiet arrangements between cops and street-level dealers, and text messages hinted at bribes. A handful of cash here, a new phone there. Some victims had been coerced into silence, given harsh warnings, or threatened with losing their jobs or homes if they spoke up. Those who did manage to complain usually found their reports conveniently lost or ignored. Every single accusation against someone like Emma was not just a random mistake. It was a small part of a much larger machine, one that turned innocent people's lives upside down just to keep the gears moving. Rachel pointed out how clear it had all become, now that they could see the pattern, that no single person had made it happen alone. The web was held together by all kinds of silent agreements, each one feeding the next. At first, Emma found herself boiling with anger, but she was not willing to let that energy go to waste. She pressed Rachel and the rest of the investigation team to go beyond just putting a few bad actors behind bars. She wanted every file reviewed, every manipulated case reopened, and every person who had been railroaded by the crooked system given a shot at a real defense. Emma used her growing voice to speak with lawyers and reporters, insisting that fixing things meant more than revenge or headlines. She spoke up at city meetings, telling her story and the stories she had collected from others who were too scared to speak publicly. Emma argued that real justice would mean rebuilding the lives of people the system had damaged for years, finding ways to clear their records, get them work, even just offer basic apologies. She called for new oversight, better training, and more checks so that this could never happen again. For her, this fight was no longer just about clearing her own name. It was about demanding a little bit of dignity for those whose worst day had turned into a lifelong sentence thanks to the lies and the cover-ups that had run through the Phoenix justice system for far too long. A few weeks had drifted by, and Emma found herself back at the steps of Arizona State University. But this time, things could not have felt more different. Gone were the constant stares of suspicion, the anxious weight of handcuffs, and the anxious shuffle from one court date to the next. Instead, she stood in the familiar sunlight, her steps slow, pausing near the main entrance where students hurried past, juggling backpacks and coffee. A small group of folks gathered nearby. Some were students whispering to each other, a few reporters clutching notepads, and even a handful of community members who had followed Emma's story in the local news. There was no applause, just a quiet hush that settled in the air as she walked. Some recognized her right away, their expressions thoughtful, maybe even a little humbled. Instead of the suspicious glances she once felt everywhere, Emma noticed only respectful silence. It was not so much awe as it was understanding, a wordless realization that what one person can endure, what they can stand up for, shakes something loose in the people watching. Emma did not look for news cameras, and she certainly was not chasing some moment of glory. She was here for something bigger. Her focus was on the changes she wanted, real, lasting fixes so no one else would face what she had. She had started meeting with state officials and community groups, pushing for rules that made it harder for cases to slip through the cracks. She joined talks about how police training needed to include more than just the letter of the law, but real lessons in fairness, bias, and dignity. As she reached the top of the stairs, Emma made eye contact with a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, standing with a book clutched to her chest. Their eyes met for only a moment, but so much passed between them, a sense of shared hope and resolve, the way courage can move from one person to another without a single word spoken. Emma smiled, and in that smile was the truth that even after everything, new roots of hope could take hold in the most barren soil. She kept walking, knowing she had helped plant something lasting. The day felt quieter than she expected, but Emma realized that sometimes genuine change starts not with cheers or speeches, but with small, silent gestures that reshape what everyone believes is possible. When Emma finally walked through the front door of her apartment, she felt every bit of the journey settle onto her shoulders. She closed the door quietly and leaned against it for a moment, just listening to the ordinary sounds of her place, the hum of the fridge, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. It was so different from the steady click of courtroom doors or the harsh glare of overhead lights at the station. Letting her breath out, she noticed her suitcase sitting just inside the hallway, exactly where she had left it before her life turned upside down. For a minute, she stared at it, that old battered thing with scratches on the side and a sticker from an Atlanta layover. It felt more like a badge of survival than luggage now, a reminder of what she had carried through and what she could not leave behind. Emma shrugged off her coat and reached for the shirt she had worn that first awful night. As her fingers traced the worn fabric, she felt a strange mix, tiredness, yes, but also a stubborn strength that had seen her through every long night and each hard conversation. That shirt, once just something she threw on without thinking, now meant promises to herself, to keep going, to help others, to make the struggle count for something more than her own freedom. The stillness of the apartment let her pause, but Emma knew this was not the end. A few hours of quiet would have to be enough. She grabbed a notebook from the kitchen table and started jotting down names she remembered. Other women who had called her, folks she had met at the courthouse, witnesses who never got their day in court. The work that mattered would happen here, beyond the headlines and the closed court files. It meant visiting the people who needed a friend to walk with them into another scary meeting, or who just longed for someone to listen. It meant helping them connect with lawyers who actually cared, pushing for investigations to be restarted, and making sure new cases would not fade out in silence. For Emma, real justice started in these small, stubborn acts. To her, winning was never about a dramatic finish. Victory was about never handing over the story of your life to someone else. She would keep choosing every step, no matter how quiet or hard, believing that the future was still hers to decide.